Is the world becoming a scarier place? People certainly think so. Since 2004, interest in the search term anxiety has skyrocketed. People are becoming increasingly fearful. How has the world become so scary? The daunting world doesn't come out of nowhere. Its unnerving qualities are constructed. How? The good place to start is with reductive media portrayals. What is it exactly about them that makes the world seem so dreadful? The kicker is dramatization. Shock value sells. Sensationalized violence attracts attention. I mean, the highest grossing movies of all time are extremely violent. But it's not only movie violence that's hyperbolized, but also news coverage. Studies have demonstrated that people who watch more of the news tend to have a higher sense of insecurity and to see conflict is constantly teetering on the horizon. Why is that the case? The key lies in the state. Consider, for example, the history of the US. It's hard to separate war from that, right? Remember 2003? News outlets spewed broadcasts and articles about the latest greatest danger to the US, Iraq. The Bush administration pushed for war. The frenzy culminated in it. The cause? Iraq's alleged possession of chemical weapons. Politicians and the corporate media worked hard to convince the public, terrified in the aftermath of 9/11, that their insecurities could be quelled by fighting a brutal dictator, Saddam Hussein. What they failed to mention was that this dictator had actually been installed by the US decades earlier. Those facts were inconvenient now, as record audiences tuned in and pro-war narratives turned the greatest profits. The Hussein government was thus pitched as an imminent threat that needed to be quenched. But of course, we know now that Iraq never had chemical weapons, that its cause was a lie. Despite the evidence and strong opposition from anti-war movements, the majority of people in the US refused to hear this truth, choosing to support the war instead. This had atrocious consequences. An estimated 315,910 Iraqis died due to violent conflicts started over a fabrication of the media and the state. Meanwhile, trillions of dollars were bundled into military industries and Western oil corporations gained contracts to exploit Iraq's large petroleum reserves. US imperialism in Iraq shows that fear is a powerful tool, politically and economically. Politicians, pundits, and even academics are complicit in creating a culture of fear, exploiting and manipulating people's anxieties to realize political objectives, advance careers, and generate profits. I mean, here's a pie of US federal discretionary spending in the 2021 fiscal year from the National Priorities Project. And here's another one of projected US federal budget allocations in 2024 by the War Resisters League. Why is military spending so high? US militarism is portrayed as an existential necessity because of the threat of another country matching the US's military might. Politicians justify excessive military spending by pointing to China and Russia's militarism as a danger to the US's hegemony. Culture fear isn't exclusive to politics. Fear's profitability is enticing to companies. Insecurity is a selling point. Companies prey on it to promote product consumption. For example, look at gun purchases. What motivates someone to buy a gun? Gun ads can give us a good example of that. Look at this one for example. A word that stands out from this video is protecting. It's tied to something people aren't keen on losing, their families. This ad frames gun ownership as a protective measure in order to get something from the audience. In this case, a purchase. That's the culture of fear at work. Fear, insecurity, danger, they cultivate malaise. Paranoia, distress, loneliness feels ripe for manipulation. Following 9/11, trepidation lingered in the air. This uneasiness was channeled into the passing of the Patriot Act. Surveillance laws were distended. The government could now easily monitor phone and email communications, collect bank and credit reporting records, and track internet activity. Unease allocated greater power to the government. After the uncertainty of 9/11, privacy became dangerous. Order became the proposed solution. The antidote to our insecurities would be greater state control over our lives. But is order always a net good? Can order become a justification for violence? Law and order, the catchphrase of the police. The word order brings the concept of justice to mind. But is policing just? Data would suggest otherwise. In countries like the US, where the state incarcerates more people than anywhere else on earth, people of color and low-income people are disproportionately criminalized, incarcerated, and killed by the police. The reason why? It makes money. Local police departments are beckoned to impose and collect fees, fines, and asset forfeitures by municipalities hungry for revenue. As more people are criminalized, the private sector gets involved. Even when the jails themselves are not for profit, there are still many contracts to dole out for corporations that provide services in telecommunications, food and catering, transportation, GPS, housing personnel, and security. Some of these private profits get reinvested into political campaigns, as donors from these firms provide support for candidates who promise to keep the term. And news channels have more police stories to report to violence-thirsty audiences. Thus, the spoils of the capitalist carceral system are distributed, and many people get their cut. In the history of this country, it is clear that policing is driven by race and money rather than justice. The underbelly of exploitative policing is greed not as an innate human quality, as it is often considered, but rather as a social construct and as a venerated principle at the basis of dominant social institutions. This isn't a timeless universal phenomenon, but rather a historically specific process that emerged out of a particular context, and that was European colonialism, as seen with US policing, with slave patrols, and over-policing areas with non-white populations. Building on older practices of imperialism through warfare, accumulation, displacement, and exploitation, Europeans developed and imposed nearly everywhere a socio-economic system where extraction, genocide, and enslavement could be considered not only morally valid, but also scientific, inevitable, and unobjectionable. From these processes originates the global capitalist economy of today. Expansionism, imperialism, colonialism, and militarism are no strangers to this. But how does racism fit into all of this? Indian-born British writer Kenan Malik divulges the definition of racism in its feigned objectivity. Malik airs that racism is, quote, a bundle of ideologies that maintain a system of oppression, end quote, that with, quote, 19th century science, reason, and universalism came to be harnessed to a discourse of race, not to be explained through historical analysis, but through the nature of scientific and rational thought, end quote. The US has plenty of experiences in this arena. Manifest Destiny embodies the same greed-motivated expansionism and militarism. Through this ideology, US leaders claimed that they were divinely entitled to expand across all of North America, without regard for indigenous peoples. The process of foreign political domination isn't exclusive to expansionism. Colonialism similarly functions, except with direct subjugation. Colonialism's complexity breeds various terms within a broad definition of European political conquest. Settler colonialism and post-colonialism are the main two. Settler colonialism is a subtype of colonialism, where foreign settlers move to and permanently reside on land inhabited by indigenous residents. Colonialism might seem like a remnant of the past, but settler colonial states beg to differ. Indigenous peoples are actively displaced in every continent. The nation-state isn't the end-all be-all to understanding the world. What if we looked at the US, South Africa, and South America under the lens of indigeneity? Indigeneity questions whether nation-state demarcations are truly representative of the complex identities, communities, and affiliations with which they overlap in any given context. As for post-colonialism, it's the political and theoretical struggle of societies who are experiencing the transition from political dependence to sovereignty. Throwing off the reins of colonialism is hard. Latin America is a keen example of this. The Latin American independence movement is contextualized as direct opposition of Iberian and French colonialism, but modern Latin American states are still heavily influenced by their history as colonies for more than 3 centuries, showing profound legacies of institutionalized colorism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and militarism. Why is that the case? Turns out that the mostly white and male, wealthy landowners who became the famous Latin American revolutionary leaders weren't looking to make radical change. Instead, these criollos like San Martin, Bolivar Hidalgo, and others were tired of their second-class status in the Spanish and Portuguese caste system, and they felt a sense of national pride in being more authentic rulers of the Americas than their peninsular overlords. Opportunistically, they switched sides at the last minute, after centuries of black and indigenous-led resistance had built enough momentum, and they were certain to soon end colonial rule. But they were uninterested in challenging race-based hierarchies or in radically transforming the exploitative legal and economic systems built through colonialism. They were merely trying to put their self-interests at the forefront of the struggle. The independence movement offered the chance for becoming the new, uncontested rulers of the Americas. Only in Haiti did revolutionary ideals become governing policy in the aftermath of independence. In most other countries, marginalized groups, despite being the leaders of the resistance, from the very beginning, saw virtually no change when domestic white elites got their way and the European armies retreated. The newly born countries stalled or completely sidelined goals like abolishing slavery, redistributing resources, and reinstituting indigenous land, choosing instead to maintain the same old systems, now with themselves at the helm. Imperialism coincides with colonialism's definition, but with an emphasis on an indirect approach to subordination. Britain's colonies epitomize imperialism. The duty of controlling the colonies was delegated to local rulers in them. This critical understanding of today's countries as settler colonial states inspires a slew of crucial questions about the worlds we inhabit, like, to what extent is our system of nation-states legitimate if it was born in this context? Can international institutions built on competing financial interests, tenuous treaties, the nation-state, and widespread militarism be trusted to fix global problems like the collapse of the climate? And even more fundamentally, what even is the relevance of today's borders? Borders exist to preserve white supremacy and racialized exploitation, trapping people into particular labor regimes and preventing their mobility. White by Law by Ian Haney Lopez confronts the racial dimensionality of borders. Lopez inspects the Naturalization Act of 1870, which only extended naturalization eligibility to free white persons. People could only stay within the U.S.'s borders if they were white. This piece of legislation enmeshed race into the definition of U.S. citizenship. Borders today preserve this legacy by demarcating areas and peoples that can be exploited, polluted, and bombed for the benefit of the whiter parts of the world. But what is whiteness? George Lipsitz, a professor at UC Santa Barbara, explains what whiteness is and what its functionality is. According to him, whiteness is an ideology of entitlement. Whiteness ascribes, quote, different racial groups unequal access to citizenship and property through systematic efforts from colonial times to the present to create a possessive investment in whiteness for European Americans, end quote. Essentially, whiteness is a mechanism for garnering and maintaining privilege, and it is an institutionalized pathology that makes people feel superior enough to take what they want, even without permission. What Lipsitz fails to expand on is the colonial underpinnings of whiteness. Michael G. Van's The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt confronts this by analyzing what prompted white soldiers in the Vietnam War to form enclaves that perpetuated unnecessary violence. Van states that colonial whiteness's relationship with violence was paradoxical because, quote, white privilege was built upon the bloodshed of conquest, brutal crushing of revolts, and quotidian repressions of daily life, end quote. Ultimately, quote, the threat of native violence under the guise of rebellion, political struggle, or criminality, end quote, caused, quote, racial violence to become a central feature of life in French Hanoi, end quote. White identity in colonial context thus was defined by violence. Settlers' insecurity was based on fears of native resistance, and their solution was to terrorize and overpower natives into submission through everyday acts of brutality. But a piece of the pie we haven't touched on is gender. Specifically, how does masculinity operate as a mechanism of oppression, and how does it interact with other oppressive systems? Iris Marion Young's Polity and Group Difference, a critique of the ideal of universal citizenship, pinpoints how ideas about the human and citizen are actively characterized as masculine, effectively excluding women from the public sphere. Young finds that, quote, the generality of the public thus depends on excluding women. The effects of masculinism are palpable in the academic canon of the West, predating but exemplified by the writings of Aristotle, celebrated as a foundational figure in European philosophy. Aristotle openly wrote that women were naturally inferior to men. Later, the mythologized kidnapping of the Sabines by early Romans was taught and celebrated for centuries. It was glorified, for example, in countless sculptures and paintings during the Renaissance, and even in recent decades, it has become the subject of uncritical films, plays, and books. The prevalence of a myth in which masses of women were abducted for their reproductive power points to a strong veneration for misogyny in the West. Progress, innovation, central tenets of modernity. But at what cost do they come? And do their negative effects outweigh their benefits? A deeper analysis reveals the consequences of concepts that seem pristine. In the name of efficiency, atrocities are committed and justified for the greater good. Critics of characterizing modernization as irreproachable hinge on its blowback. Jane Collins's The Age of Walmart identifies the calamities generated by a corporation in search of profit maximization. Collins highlights that, quote, Walmart's success is built on the impoverishment of workers both here and abroad, who lose out in the race to the bottom. Labor devaluation is the key to Walmart's profitability, a symptom of systems of exploitation common to global corporations. Corporations like Walmart today bank on, and cultivate through their advertisements a mindless culture of accumulation that has been central to colonialism from the beginning. In this process, whiteness, maleness, and entitlement combined and became justified under the guise of productivity, efficiency, and expediency. Evidence of how commonplace this mentality has been over the past centuries can be found in countless pieces of literature. One example is from the 18th century in Michael Addis's book, Machines as the Measure of Man. The opening of his work focuses on William Smith's encounter with Western Africans who lived alongside the Gambia River. Smith believes that he is entitled to taking African land because he has, quote, superior technology and religion as a, end quote, as a white male colonizer. The logic and rhetoric of process and progress becomes instrumental to Smith's co-optation of African land and labor, demonstrating the disproportionate benefits and damages caused by this rationalization. It was this belief in white, colonial male superiority that motivated the erasure of cultures and traditions that contradicted it. The concept of epistemicide, the killing, silencing, annihilation, or devaluing of a knowledge system, describes this phenomenon. Although epistemicide has been framed as a feature of the past, it ardently continues in this day and age. The Texas Board of Education, for example, has been rewriting history with political intent for decades, and more recently, the Floridian Governor Ron DeSantis banned educational material that delved into critical race theory. Policies like these silence efforts to confront the construction of race and its impacts. The ongoing prevalence of colonial epistemicide teaches us that the present actively embodies the past. In this video, we tackled the questions of what is violence, where does it come from, and how does it manifest? And ultimately, what are we supposed to do with this information? Violence is about insecurity. It is about controlling things that make us feel afraid and enforcing this through harm. However, the paradox is that violence only offers the semblance of power and control, but it generates long-term trauma and immeasurable effects that get passed down through generations, institutionalized and normalized. As the old adage goes, violence begets violence and becomes cyclical, and thus our sense of security is predicated on a constant escalation of destructive power. More and more violence becomes necessary to maintain authority. Is this the only way we can relate to each other? Does humanity have the capacity for cooperation and collaboration? This is not only possible, but given our multiplying crises, it is our responsibility to work towards it and be the ones who break these cycles. Let's do better together. For more on that, check out our next 2 videos.